Hey everyone, this is Caron Whitaker with the League of American Bicyclists. I'm going to give it one more minute before I get started. All right, okay. Thanks everyone. Somehow, Becky, instead of changing Bike Summit to my name, I changed your FBA account to my name. So feel free to change that back. All right. So I'll get started. Hi, everyone. This is Caron Whitaker with the League of American Bicyclists. This is a federal policy update webinar. And I'm going to talk about what passed in that bipartisan infrastructure bill, and then talk a little bit about how the House is reacting and what's in the bill now for how the House is reacting, and then the reconciliation process, because I think there may be some opportunities there for us as well. And I've got a lot to cover. I'm going to try to watch the chat box as we go and answer questions. And hopefully there will be some time at the end. I also just want to share that if I don't get to your question, or if you have a question later, either a short-term question about this presentation or a long-term question about the next bill, please feel free to email them. And I'm going to suggest you email them to Christian. Christian is interning with me, and his inbox, I think, is a little less cluttered than mine. And so we're going to try to create a big Q&A, maybe on a Google fact sheet or something like that, so everyone can see each other's questions and get them answered that way. So if you do have a question that I don't get to in this presentation, please do send it to Christian. All right. So okay. So I'm sorry, we still got people coming in. So to get started and talk about what is in the bipartisan deal, the infrastructure bill that just passed, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's in it overall. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the amendments that you may have seen emails about. And then I'm going to talk about what's in it for biking and walking. And then just a quick explanation of where the league is on the bill. I know that there's been a lot of groups that are opposed to it. I'm really hoping to see it pass, and just want to give folks an update on that. So as I get started, there's a couple things I want to talk about, give some explanation to as we get started. The first is when we're talking about what funding is in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there's a couple of different types of funding. First, you'll hear it's above baseline, and that means above what money is being spent now. So Congress was already creating a transportation reauthorization bill. They do that every 5 years. So for transportation, the baseline is what's being spent on funding right now. All of that still has to get reauthorized, but the status quo is baseline. And then we see two different types of funding in this. One is contract authority, and that comes from the authorizing committee. The easiest way to think about it in terms of transportation is that's what comes out of the Highway Trust Fund. So in a normal bill, if it's contract authority, it means the bill is deciding for 5 years what that funding will be, and that funding is set for 5 years. For most federal government spending, it has to come through appropriations, and so they have to do it every single year. So the RAISE grant funding is like that. A lot of transit funding is like that. Amtrak funding is like that. But so is defense funding, health funding, all of that, where every year Congress has to decide. So that's what what appropriations is. What we're seeing in the BIB is that regular contract authority, that would be like a 5-year bill. So it's going to look like a normal transportation bill. And then there's a one-time appropriation which covers 5 years. So I'm saying that because if something is in contract authority, then 5 years from now, when we go to write the next reauthorization bill, that's going to be considered the normal bill. But the general appropriations is what feels more like a stimulus, like a one-time jump to the transportation funding. And so this bill has a lot of that future appropriations. So it's guaranteed, but it's what would come above what is the normal transportation program. So when we look at that, if you read in the headlines, we say total new funding of over baseline is 550. So when they say it's 1.2 trillion, half of that money is baseline funding that they're just reauthorizing. Okay, and then when we look at that new funding, roughly half of it goes to transportation. I think we sometimes use transportation and infrastructure as interchangeable, so we think of it all as transportation, but that's not true. Only half of that money is transportation, and some of that money goes to airports and pipelines and things that don't have to do with surface transportation. So let me see. I'm sorry, trying to let people in. All right. So this is a little rough in terms of estimates. These numbers are all in billions of dollars. And it's what I have figured out so far. So I know there's, this is more to give you a general sense. Don't look at these numbers as necessarily specific. But what you see here, that new contract authority, it's like if we just did a reauthorization bill with 90 billion more dollars in it. That's what it'll look like. That's what we'll look at next time. The one-time appropes are sort of, let's get in there and fix our bridges. So for the FHWA is the Federal Highways Administration. That's roads and bridges. That one-time push, that basically 48 billion, that is all for bridges. So that idea is, it's like, let's catch up, let's do repair and maintenance. So a lot of the FTA is transit. A lot of that also is just like, is repair, things like that. So the new contract authority, some of that goes through a number of different programs in the transportation bill. The 2.2 under the other, that is funding for NHTSA, which is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So this is just to give you the sense that there's a piece of this that is going to grow the transportation system, and then the majority of this is really just a one-time 5-year piece. All right. And so I also want to compare what's in the bid, this reauthorization plus the extra, that one-time, or the reauthorization plus new contract authority versus what was in the House Invest in America bill. As many of you know, the House bill was not bipartisan. It was all Democratic, but it was very progressive. And a lot of the progressive community was really happy with it because it had a lot of great policies like Fix It First, a real emphasis on climate, performance measures that had some teeth to it, things like that. But when we look at the actual numbers here in terms of contract authority, they're not that different. The real difference is in the policies on those things. So when we think about policies, there were two things we wanted to see. One, we, as the league, we wanted to see more sort of people-centric investment. So increases in funding for biking and walking, better transit, complete streets funds and policies, more local control. And then we wanted to see less auto-centric. So there's sort of two pieces to the puzzle. The less auto-centric would limit state flexibility. So you have like a fix-it-first policy or a fix-it-right policy that really focuses on maintenance of what you have before you build new capacity. Performance measures with teeth. So if you're setting safety performance measures, that there's there's some consequence if you're not meeting your benefits or your goals. We often talk about there's discretionary versus formula funding. So formula funding is the amount of funding that a state gets. Just say, okay, here's how many safety dollars Massachusetts gets, and here's how much congestion mitigation Massachusetts gets. And then the state figures it out based on the rules. Discretionary are grants that have to go through USDOT. And so I think there's a push for more discretionary on that so that there's criteria on how they spend that. And there was also within the larger progressive transportation movement a real ask that the ratio between highway and transit spending changed. So right now, highway and roads gets 80%, transit gets 20%. They wanted to see it closer to a 50-50. What we got in the Senate bill is we did get those people-centric policies. What we didn't get was less auto-centric. And so that's if you're, for instance, Transportation for America, some other groups I know have been, if you're on transportation Twitter, you've been seeing a lot of people complaining about this bill. That's a big reason that they are complaining. So I want to talk a little bit about the amendment process that we went through. There were a number of amendments that the league supported. These were all amendments that focused on what was on the House bill that was not in the Senate bill that we wanted to see. So we wanted stronger performance measures. We wanted a different way to measure traffic projections so that we weren't just building excess capacity, which is what's happened in the last couple decades. That idea of a fix it first to really push states to do maintenance and keep their roads in a state of good repair before they built new roads. And more funding for the Reconnecting Communities program, which funds communities that have been divided by a highway to either remove the highway and reconnect the community or build over the highway or somehow reconnect that community. That's important for low-income communities and communities of color where we've seen a lot of roads go through. There was also a bicycle commuter benefit. And to be honest on that, we knew at the time that, that it wasn't, I'm going the wrong way, that we would need 10 Republican votes for it to pass. We didn't have those votes, so we never brought it up for a vote because you don't want to lose a vote if you have another opportunity to get it in. What we did want to do was get it into a manager's amendment. So sometimes, there's a bill, it goes through this amendment process. Before it goes to the final vote, sometimes the committee managers, the leaders of the committee get together and say, we'd like to make a couple of changes here and there. And we were hoping to get it in there. There wasn't a manager's amendment so far. I don't know if there will be one going forward, but it was just another opportunity we took a shot. I don't think there was a manager's amendment, but it was up to Senator Wyden from Oregon and Ranking Member Crapo from Idaho. And I just want to say a lot of thanks to our friends in Idaho who reached out about this, because we're still working on that. We think we have a chance in reconciliation. And then I want to spend a couple minutes talking about the Recreational Trails program, because you may have seen some emails from me, you may have gotten some alerts on this, and I just want to, it was a little controversial because the national bike groups disagreed on this a bit. So just a little background on the program in general. The Recreational Trails program was originally based on fuel taxes paid by like ATVs and snowmobiles, things like that. And the idea was because they were paying this tax, that money should go to creating facilities for them. The actual funding was decoupled years ago, but the idea has always been there. It's always sort of been congressional intent that money be spent for recreational trails. There's been a deal within the coalition that 30% will go to those motorized trails for ATVs, snowmobiles, things like that, 30% for this says should be 30% motorized, 30% non-motorized, sorry. And then the 40% is a combination of the two. But what happened in 2012 when all the bike ped programs got stuck together into one program, they got stuck at that 81 million a year at 2009 levels. They have been pushing, particularly since 2019, for an increase in funding. And what they wanted to do is get a fuel tax study that showed how much are these off-road vehicles paying in taxes, because they should be getting most of that money. I forget what percentage it used to be, but it was pretty high. For us, we were supportive of that, and we were clear with everyone involved. We would support it as long as it doesn't take from transportation alternatives, the other biking and walking funding. And so that's where we've been for a while. In 2020, they did get into the appropriations bill a requirement for federal highways to study the gas tax paid by recreational vehicles. Unfortunately, it's good that that study came back. It's unfortunate that it didn't come back until July 29th. And so because we were able to change it in the House to make sure that that funding didn't come out of transportation alternatives, in the Senate, that didn't happen. What that report showed is that they pay $281 million a year in recreational vehicle gas taxes. So more than 3 times what they're getting. So obviously the recreational trails program should be getting more money for that. The tricky part for us is that in 2012, there were 3 bike ped programs that were combined. Transportation enhancements, safe routes to school funding, and recreational trails were all combined into transportation alternatives. That looks like this. You may have seen me give this diagram before. So the state gets a portion, rec trails comes off the top, and the rest of the money goes through the transportation alternatives piece that goes out to cities to build bike lanes and trails and sidewalks, bike parking, all of those things. And because of this, when they wrote the amendment, that money would have come out of the roads funding, which would have meant it would take $1 billion from the safe routes to school and the road bike ped funding to go to rec trails. And it really pitted us against each other. So that's why we've been trying before to write an amendment to say that whatever new money comes to rec trails should be on top of what transportation alternatives is already getting. That was the way we wrote the amendment in the House. That didn't happen in the Senate. So when that first amendment came out, we were opposed to it because it was $1 billion. And we do want them to get it. We tried to find a solution. Senator Cardin, who wrote the Transportation Alternatives Bill, had been talking for over a month with them about how do we do this so it doesn't hurt both programs. There was never an agreement was made. Eventually they said, okay, we're not going to do an amendment because like us on the bike commuter thing, they didn't want that amendment to fail. Then they decided to do an amendment anyway, but it was different. And it was, so if it was 45 billion, that should be million, 45 million a year. So it would have been a lot less, would have been about 200 million. There might've been a deal to be made there. We were trying to find a deal. But the argument they made was around congressional intent. And so for the people that created transportation alternatives, that was really controversial because that was not the intent. So it didn't happen. Unfortunately, part of the reason it didn't happen that way is because when Transportation Alternatives was formed, the Rec Trails program didn't take a hit. The road programs and the Safe Routes to School programs did take a hit. We took a 30% hit, but the agreement was that we would take the increase through time. This new bill would just get us whole. And so that's what the controversy was. I'm talking to folks in the Rec Trails Coalition. We're hoping we can find a solution. One of the things we've been talking about is if we could get the two programs separated so they can't be pit against each other again in that way. I don't know, we're still looking at that. I would love for folks to make some comments in the chat to know, if you're working for a bike ped, a biking and walking advocacy group now, do you use the recreational trails program? Would you know how to use it? if you wanted to, how often do you work with your IMBA group? Anything that lets us know how much you use the rec trail programs. And because we're trying to figure out, would it be a problem if the programs were separated? Because we want both programs to be robust. We want both of them to work. Obviously, we need to know where the Rec Trails Coalition is on that, but that's what we're thinking about. And I just wanted to explain that because I know there was a lot of back and forth during the debate. All right, so I'm going to talk quickly about what's in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill for biking and walking. I'm going to go through this a little bit faster than normal because I've covered most of this before. And when I send the slides, I'll send all the slides that give more in detail. So when we talk about transportation alternatives, there is a 70% increase in that funding. There's more local control. Basically, everything that we had asked for is in that bill. There's one thing that was in the House bill that's not in this one, which is the House bill asked the Secretary of Transportation to figure out a way to get the projects through the permitting process quicker. That is something we'd like to work on. It's not specific to this bill in transportation alternatives, but we're still talking with the USDOT on that. There's also, we had talked about the Connecting America's Active Transportation Program that would fund networks throughout a community where you could get a lump grant to fill in the gaps in your networks, build a network, or connect one community to another through what they call a spine. The Senate bill authorizes it, so it allows it to be funded, but it doesn't actually put the funding in. So that is not funded in this bill. When we talk to safety, there's a ton in safety. I actually really like the Senate safety pieces better than what was in the House bill, or most of it, because one thing it says that if your state has a high rate of vulnerable road user fatalities, so if 15% or more of your state's fatalities are people biking, walking, or rolling, then the state has to spend 15% of their highway safety dollars on that. Right now, we average about maybe a little more than 1% of safety funds go to biking and walking. So an increase of, for those states that have an issue, and it's about 23 states, that's a huge jump in funding. Now, all states are going to have to do a vulnerable road user safety assessment where they have to list the dangerous areas and potential fixes. That's a huge help from an advocacy perspective, because then you can go back and say, hey, you already identified this area as dangerous. When are you going to do something about it? It requires the Federal Highways Administration to do new research, to put in some proven safety countermeasures for biking and for walking. It also looks specifically at areas we know are dangerous, like arterials. And it's written both to improve safety and promote biking and walking. So it's not a situation where the state could say, oh, the best way to keep people safe here is just not allow them to bike on it. Finally, they take a safe systems approach, and that's integrated throughout the highway safety program. And it's a whole bunch of little things down to little definitions, so that if you're doing an intersection, how much is that intersection going to help people who are biking and walking? So that's real improvement. It has to be in every state's safety plan. There's also a Safe Streets for All program, which is very much like a Vision Zero program. There was $1 billion for this already in the underlying commerce bill, and then the BIB added another 5. So now there's $6 billion over 5 years. It will fund communities to write plans, and those plans have to cover engineering, education, and enforcement programs. It also, and then once you've done the plan and it's been approved, then the government, then they can fund projects within the plan. So that could be engineering, it could be actually building things on the ground, it could be education, it could be enforcement, and it covers the planning and design and development of that project. So lots of times we know with transportation alternatives, some states have decided that they won't cover the planning or design stage, which makes it really hard to then get the actual project built. This is going to run through the Office of the Secretary, so it will fund that planning and design. From the league's perspective, we're happy to see money going for safe streets. We are concerned over the enforcement language because there's no safeguards on that. And we, as the league, have a position that we don't support new enforcement money unless there's like a prohibiting racial profiling component to it or something like that. So we haven't talked about this as much, but I think there's, there's a lot of good things in it. There is what I think is a drafting error where it says 40% of the funding has to go to plans. That's $2.4 billion worth of planning. We are been talking with some folks. We're hoping that we can get some technical changes to make that 10%, which I think was the original goal. So if your community doesn't have a Vision Zero plan, or they're interested in doing something like that, a towards zero death or whatever, if this bill passes, they should do it right away because there's going to be a ton of money for planning. And then we'd like to switch it so that there's more money for the actual projects. Complete streets and accessibility. There's a requirement for states to write complete street standards. The House bill had the FHWA, had the federal arm, federal highways doing it. This bill requires a state to do it, and it gives them funding to do it. Once they have the standards, they can write priority plans, they can write bike ped plans, they can write any kind of plan that's going to help improve safety for people outside of cars. So I think that's a good thing. A lot of funding. This, as you can see, pieces of the bill get written separately, so there's a little bit of an overlap here. There's also an accessibility pilot program that's going to provide better data so that a community, when you're planning on what you need, you can say, okay, if we build a bike ped bridge over this major highway, we're going to connect 6,000 families to jobs and services on this side. Or, and we can compare that with that same amount of money going to build, an extra car lane or an extra transit. So you can compare and contrast those things. So we think that's a really good first step to getting to that accessibility performance measure. Also, right now, if a state gets money to rebuild after a hurricane or something like that, they're supposed to build back exactly what they had. And that has meant you can't add a sidewalk, you can't add a bike lane, you can't buy a new bus. You have to buy a bus that was the same age as the old bus, things like that. So we're trying to fix that so that you can build complete streets with emergency relief funds, and that's in there. So a city doesn't just have to build it back exactly. They could, maybe add sidewalks or bike lanes, things like that, maybe do a road diet and the redesign of it so it doesn't have to look exactly like it looked before. Vehicle safety, for the first time, this is the first bill that will require vehicle safety include the safety of people outside of cars or vulnerable road users. There's updates to the new car assessment program. So if you ever go to buy a car and there's the 5-star rating system, there's going to have to be a rating for vulnerable road users and how well that car addresses that, and also crash avoidance. Weirdly, those two things are not necessarily combined in this bill, but that's something we can work out with DOT moving forward. There's a new rule on headlights. Our headlight regulations date back to 1969. And so we haven't been able to introduce a lot of the new technology that's all over Europe. Hopefully a new rule will allow that. There's also a first draft rule on hoods and bumpers. So we know that depending on how hoods and bumpers are manufactured, they can reduce the injury caused by impact. So it's crash worthiness versus crash avoidance. This gets us a step forward. It's not perfect. It's not exactly what we wanted, but it's better than what was there. There's all kinds of climate funding, a lot of which biking and walking will be eligible for. And this is something to really think about. We've always really focused in on transportation alternatives and CMAQ, the congestion mitigation. This bill, I think, creates opportunities for a lot of other places biking and walking can fit in. So we're eligible for all these programs on top. I just listed a few of the others so folks could see that that's there. And something to think about with your, when you're talking to your local government or on the planning process is that when they're doing something for climate, why not also address biking and walking? We can help with that. A couple of other things, the RAISE grants, so if biking and walking is usually 1% to 2% of overall highway spending or transportation spending, under the RAISE grants, which used to be Build, which used to be Tiger, we're more in the 3% to 5%. So we generally do better on those. So instead of 500 million a year, it's going to be 1.5 or 7.5 billion over 5 years. The SMART grants I put in here, these are grants for local governments to experiment with and try to employ new technology. So allowing cars to talk to pedestrians, allowing cars to talk to infrastructure. There were a bunch of proposals out there. We really pushed for this one because this one has some special safeguard language for biking and walking, requiring that projects do not block the access for other modes when they're trying them out, which is something we saw doing, like maybe if we just make this network for AVs and don't allow people to bike and walk, then like it'll be safe. So we didn't want that because we don't want to block access. We also want to improve safety for everyone. So that's out there too. There's also sort of this sleeper regulation in there about access to bridges. And it's been there for a while that said that if you're building a new bridge or you're reconstructing a bridge, you're supposed to have access for people biking. This bill changes it to to add pedestrians, which is really important. It does say that it's, they have to do this unless it's cost prohibitive, which is sort of this vague term, right? So now that we're seeing basically $50 billion going into bridge funding, one of the things I've been talking with folks over at USDOT on and hope to continue talking with them about is, hey, how do we make this provision work? How do we make sure that bridges, especially bridges that connect biking and walking infrastructure, that there is a connection there? So that's another huge opportunity. So, so that. So then the question comes, is this a good bill or a bad bill? Because there are a lot of good things for biking and walking, but we also know a lot of our partners that sort of look at the larger program or, don't love it exactly. And I think that there's a couple of things on this. Let me just, So it really depends what you compare it to. Because it's never just a binary decision. Do we take this bill or not? It's, what is it compared to? So the House bill, yeah, we like that better, but it was partisan. It was never going to pass the Senate. The EPW bill combined with the House Invest Act, if they had been conference, that probably would have been the best overall. We wouldn't have gotten that extra safe streets money, but there wouldn't have been all this new money for roads. So that might have been better too. Current law, if it was current law, we'd be stuck at 1% of safety funding. We'd be stuck at TA at 850 million a year while everything else grew around us. So I think it is better than current law. And more importantly, this reauthorization bill, it has to be done. If it's not done this Congress, it's going to get done next Congress. And we don't know what that next Congress is going to be like. And so for me, I'd rather take this bill than roll the dice on another bill. Especially in the House where it was a very partisan bill, just Democrats. The Republicans were very angry about that. And I'm afraid that if the Republicans were to take over the House, we would see a bill that really divested all of the Democratic priorities. And that could really hurt biking and walking. It would definitely hurt transit. And so for the League, it's not a perfect bill, but we do support it getting done. And it's not great on climate, but again, if we get a reauthorization bill next time that was all about building new roads and had no climate money, which is where the House Republicans were, that could be worse. I want to talk a second about the role of the administration. Actually, I'm gonna. Okay. I'm just looking at a few questions. I will send a map of the states that hit that safety piece so that they would be required to spend 15%. See a lot of comments on the Rec Trails program. Really appreciate that. All right, I'm going to go back and talk about the administration's role, because one of the really interesting things about this bill is how much money the US DOT is going to have to give out. So remember when we said there's formula funding that the states get and they just give out based on instructions? And then there's discretionary money that has to run through the US DOT. So this bill, just looking at the new appropriations, there's $100 billion that Pete Buttigieg and his team have to decide where it goes. There's another, God, I don't know, 30, 40 billion through the contract authority. So there's even more. So the good news about this from a biking and walking perspective is we know the people in the office of the secretary, we know Secretary Buttigieg has been talking a lot about biking and walking and people-centric infrastructure and safe streets. They're the ones who came up with the term "fix it right" with infrastructure. They're the ones who came up with the safe streets for all. So that's great. They're the ones we want making those decisions, at least, while they're in office. Here's the rub. That's a ton of money to get out, and they don't have the staff right now. Now, there is new funding for them to staff up. There's specifically funding for them to staff up on this, looking at this. But it's going to be a race. They're going to have to decide, which programs are they going to prioritize, when that's money is going to go out. So some of the money may be delayed. And again, if the administration changes in the next election, then the next administration gets to make the decisions. So just on here, I've just identified with the green arrows, these are all programs I think can really help biking and walking. That bridge program, again, it's something we need to watch and weigh in on and make sure that access is there. But the SMART program, the Safe Streets for All, the RAISE grants, we know how to do those things. The ADA upgrades for rail transit, when we're talking about connections to transit for people using wheelchairs, but also for people biking and walking. ADA upgrades, they're made to make things accessible for people with disabilities, but they make them more accessible for everyone outside of a car. The reconnecting communities we've talked about, all that. The red arrow, I just want to point this out. This is a railroad crossing elimination. And this is something, this is something when I see it that kind of scares me, because eliminating a railroad crossing means, eliminating where the railroad crosses the road. And so if a road becomes inaccessible, it's one thing if you're driving and you now have to go 2 or 3 miles out of your way to get someplace. If you're biking or walking, going 2 or 3 miles out of the way to get someplace really limits your accessibility and your mobility. And so that's something we're going to need to talk to folks about and make sure that's in. I also just want to give a shout out to the Eno Center for Transportation and specifically Jeff Davis. A lot of the information on the general bill I'm taking from things he's done. That's his Twitter address. He tweets out a lot. A lot of this sort of, he's one of the best minds in DC on really knowing where the funding's going. So just wanted to share that. And so when we're talking about the role of the administration, I just want to point out a couple of things have been in a couple of presentations with them this week. One was with the APBP, the Association of Pedestrian Bicycle Professionals, where they had Robin Hutchinson, who works on safety in Buttigieg's office. And she talked a lot about, there's a lot of culture change going on there. They're trying to lift the lid off of staff to allow staff to do what they know how to do. Just not feel so boxed in, like go ahead and do that. They have a real focus on equity, climate, and safety. She talked about safety being the foundation for climate. And she was asked the question, well, all this new money is going to roads. Doesn't that hinder what you're trying to do? And she was like, well, legislation is one tool, funding is another tool, but we have other tools. We're going to find ways to build the safe, accessible, sustainable system. So I thought that was a really interesting answer. Not 100% sure what it means, but it's nice to know they're thinking about it and care about these things. Also, just wanted to give a report on what they've been doing on equity, because we know there was a executive order that came down from the White House, and DOT is really taking it seriously. They had to reestablish, restaff, refund the Office of Civil Rights and give it back some authority. They're doing department-wide equity training. It's ongoing, which I think is great. They've created an equity leadership team and an equity task force to look at how to meet their goals in terms of mobility justice, climate and environmental justice, and a number of other goals for that. They also put out a notice for comment on, how should we collect data around equity? What are the methods that researchers do? It was mostly aimed at researchers, did that. And then they do have a timeline that a document from that is going to come out on September 2021. So they'll share the ideas they heard about equity data and methods. And then they have their strategic plan coming out in February. And with that, they're going to have an equity plan that, the two overlap a lot, but they also want to be very clear by having the equity plan out there. So they are sort of moving forward in those issues, and they're going to take all of this work to those decisions on those grants that I was just showing you, that 100 billion plus grants. All right. So I'm going to go back to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I got to remember that name, and talk a little bit about what's going on in the House now, because the bill can't become a law until the exact same bill is passed through both the House and the Senate. So just again, some background, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Package or Framework, the BIF, is also the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That was both that normal transportation bill plus that one-time investment. We also have been talking about the Human Infrastructure Bill that has to go through reconciliation, which was the Biden American Jobs Plan. So where we are in the House, and just to get to that reconciliation, just another sort of term definition, there's a three-step process to getting to reconciliation. First, there's a budget resolution where you set the high number, and then the budget committee divides up funding based on each Senate committee, in this case, or House committee. That's where we are in the process in the Senate. That's what they just passed. But to get to an actual reconciliation bill, each of those committees has to sit down and figure out exactly where that money's going. So right now, like EPW has to do, because they cover transportation, yes, but they also cover EPA and Interior. So there's a lot of climate work. They're supposed to do a lot of climate justice things that they need to do in their bill. And so they get that. So they have to then sit down and say, okay, well, that means $5 billion to this program and $2 billion to that program and that kind of thing. So the committees do that work. The bill comes back together as a reconciliation package, one big bill, and then it passes. And then once the Senate does it and the House does it, they have to compromise together, or they have to do what they call ping pong, where the Senate sends their bill to the House and then the House passes it, which is what we expect to happen with infrastructure. If that was clear. So there's been this big question about when is the House going to pass the infrastructure bill. Speaker Pelosi has said she's not going to bring it up for a vote until the Senate passes not only the budget resolution, which they did this week, but the final reconciliation bill. Hey, if you just unmuted yourself, could you please mute back? We're getting some feedback. So please mute yourself. We'll see what we can do. So Pelosi said, yeah, no infrastructure bill until we also get a reconciliation bill from the Senate. And her goal is to hold her Democrats together, because there's a bunch of moderate Democrats who just want to vote on infrastructure. They don't want to do the human infrastructure. They just want to do physical. And you've got a bunch of progressives who really want the human infrastructure. Some of them they're okay on the infrastructure. They're not as excited about it. And so it's this whole thing with the Democrats going back and forth. And she can only lose, I think it's 3 votes, maybe it's 4 votes in order to get a bill done. So next week, the House is going to come back. They're going to do their own budget resolution, start talking about those things. But right now, there are 9 House Democrats who said they won't vote for a budget resolution or the human infrastructure reconciliation until they get infrastructure. Now, that's a problem, because she's going to need all of her Democrats to get reconciliation, because that is going to be a partisan bill. There's going to be no Republicans on that. So that's something she has to work out. Now, Pelosi's a pretty strong leader. We'll have to see what she maybe another reason for bringing the House back together is to sort of have those conversations, because until she gets that worked out, it may not look like we get an infrastructure bill. Now the goal in both the House and the Senate, this is reconciliation, but it's for both of them, because you need reconciliation right now in order for Pelosi to bring up infrastructure, is that we need to get it by September 30th. That's when the FAST Act expires. That's the end of the fiscal year. And there's a couple of holdouts, right? Holdups. One is this that we've just been talking about within the House. The other is, if the House is doing its own reconciliation and the Senate's doing theirs, they then have to come back and combine those 2 bills. So that's a lot of work to do in 5 weeks, especially if she can't get the budget resolution passed right away. We'll have to see about that. But the other reason she really needs to get this done by the end of September is that the debt ceiling vote is coming up, and that's going to be October or November. And unless they put the debt ceiling into a reconciliation thing, they're going to need Republicans. And Minority Leader McConnell has said that Republicans won't vote for the debt ceiling unless they get spending cuts. And the easiest way to get spending cuts is to cut down on these bills that haven't been spent yet, right? So there's a whole dance here. There's really a need for them to get it in by September 30th. And I think the wild card here is President Biden and where he decides to put his influence. The reality is Democrats are facing a tight election in 2022, a tough election, and his success will help them and his failure will hurt them. And so he wants both these bills. The question is, will he settle for one? Will he really push Pelosi to do the physical infrastructure so he can at least have something for that? Or is he really going to stand behind both? And he really wants both. So there's going to be a lot of high drama in Washington in the next 6 weeks. What I will say is there's a real, even though I listen to myself say what I just said, and I'm like, oh my God, how's that ever going to happen? There's a real sense of inevitability that this is going to happen. So we're really, we'll see, especially the physical infrastructure, but that sense of inevitability is around both, I think, because the progressives, and the thing about Democrats is versus Republicans is Democrats see government as part of the solution. They're not afraid of big government. And so they want the government to work. And so it's harder for them to hold out the way it was for like the Tea Party to hold out or the Freedom Caucus to hold out. Because if you believe that government's too big already, it's easy to just say, we don't want anything. So that's a little bit different situation. So I want to talk, I'm running out of time, but I want to talk a little bit about reconciliation content, because originally President Biden said no double dipping, no physical infrastructure in the reconciliation. But the way that Bernie Sanders is the chair of the budget committee, and he wrote in some physical infrastructure. So we'll have to see what happens with that. Most of it went to the Commerce. Well, Commerce Committee is the only committee that specifically says you need to do transportation in general. So, because and I'm just showing you a tiny bit of the instructions he gave. The instructions may be 10 items, but one of them for that $83 billion for the Commerce Committee was transportation. For the Banking Committee, which is also housing and urban development and therefore covers transit, there's also some talk about transit in there. So those are the two most likely. the Finance Committee, they're the committee that have to pay for everything. They do have some instructions on how to spend money, but they have to also pay for it. So they had transportation tax incentives, and that's like the commuter benefits, e-bikes, tax credits, things like that. EPW, the only thing they had on climate really was investment in clean vehicles, but otherwise it's climate. But I think there are some things that we'd like to see that we could sell as climate. So when I think about potential asks, and haven't done all my research yet because staff are still reeling a little bit right now. But in the Finance Committee, these are some of the things we're looking at: the bicycle commuter benefit, the e-bike tax credit, rail banking, making it easier for local governments to build trails, and credit for, there's been this talk about micromobility charging stations and providing some tax credit. And in my mind, this is the order they're most likely to happen in. But I put finance in green because I think it's the most likely to happen. For EPW, there were some things in the transportation bill, like this Healthy Streets initiative, which would work on reducing the urban heat island effect and reducing flooding in urban low-income and community of color neighborhoods. I think that's something that it's not exactly transportation. It is very climate oriented. It's very equity oriented. I think that's something that might have a chance. And then we have some long shot proposals. I don't think we're going to get any new transportation alternatives money. I think the committee's feeling like they gave us a lot, but there are a couple of ideas in there. There's that Connecting America's Active Transportation, which was authorized but not funded. There's another proposal we've been working on with Lyft and Rails to Trails and People for Bikes and the bike share companies and transit and the unions that organize bike share workers to do something similar, build networks out, but with a real focus on creating an access to transit that also funds bike share. We'll see. Is there a possibility that we could do that through like a set aside in a raise grant? Maybe. I don't know if Commerce wants to give even more money to those grants because they've got 5 times the amount, but we'll try. Maybe STA, I don't know. So that's one thing we're looking at in terms of funding. Another is that we've been talking to some offices about a pilot project that would give local governments more authority over TA money. So they would get a separate set of TA money that they could then get it for 5 years, and maybe they could be the ones that act like the MPO or like the state in a lot of cases to get through the permitting process and do things like that. So that's our long shot proposal, something we're looking at. I haven't been turned down yet, but we'll see. The other thing is to look at the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Again, Chairman DeFazio wrote that huge bill, the INVEST Act, after 40 years on the Transportation Committee, and it's not going to happen. He has given up his push to get the infrastructure, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, that Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Originally he was pushing for that to be conferenced with the INVEST Act, so there'd be a little bit of both in a new bill. He's given that up. It's not going to happen, but he is looking at getting some funding under the budget resolution that he can then spend towards improving climate through transportation. So there may be some opportunities there too. We don't know yet what the House Budget Committee is going to do for that. So I'm going to turn to questions in a second, but just in summary, we know that the Senate bid, it's the largest investment ever for transit and for biking and walking, but it's also the largest investment ever for roads. And we didn't get the policies there that we would want. It's not as progressive as the House bill, but I feel fairly confident in saying it's more progressive than what we would get out of a new Congress in 2 years. Reconciliation may offer even more opportunities, and we're looking at that. And though there's still a ton of politics to overcome, there's a ton of momentum in DC that this is gonna, and a sense of inevitability that's gonna happen. So I'll stop there and answer questions. And I've also got Christian's email here too. Oops. So let me see if we have any new questions. I see RTP. So I got a question on the Rec Trails program. What would it mean to be separated? So the Rec Trails program right now, even though it's in the transportation bill, that money generally gets transferred over to a department of natural resources or something like that. So it's run out of another department. Even the way the money goes now, they're not that connected. And they used to be separate programs. So we think they could run the same way. We're asking people who use the program if that's true. We're checking with the coalition on that. So I think in terms of a trade-off, I think there was a real question back in 2012 that the Rec Trails program, Rec Trails Coalition felt that they were helping overall transportation alternatives by staying in because they, at the time, particularly had a little more Republican support. But I don't think that outweighs the situation where we get, pitted against each other. I got a question on the formulas for states the same as the FAST Act. They were basically the same for the underlying funding, and I can, Tim, I can send you the funding numbers for the underlying EPW bill, which can help. So a question about how we can fit into advocacy going forward. I think I think there is some room for advocacy, particularly around the reconciliation. And, I need to figure out where folks are right now. Right now, a lot of the folks in the Senate are exhausted and they're taking some vacation. And the House is just coming back in. So I do think there will be steps to take moving forward. One thing you could do now is that we're doing a webinar next week on communication, op-eds, LTEs, social media, and just the general push for how important it is to have safe and accessible biking and walking if we're going to meet the goals, particularly around climate, because reconciliation is going to be, there's a huge focus on climate. They don't want to talk about transportation necessarily, but if we can talk about the idea of moving trips from cars to transit, biking, and walking, and what that can do for climate, and how what's important to do that is to make things safe. I think that's what Robin Hutchinson from USDOT was getting at by saying safety is the basis for climate work, because people aren't going to bike and walk more if they don't feel safe and if they aren't safe. All right. So yeah, that whole idea of build back better and build back right that was in the president's American Jobs Plan, it's not necessarily in the bill right now, but that's why all that money that comes from grants from DOT is exciting, because they can set the criteria for that. They can set, and we hope that they will, and we will push them to do so, but do a fix-it-right, put a fix-it-right policy on top of the RAISE grants, on top of some of the other, maybe the infra grants. They've already put a climate lens on the infra grants, which are generally more freight type grants. The thing about that, will they put a fix-it-right when they're looking at eliminating railway crossings? Things like that are going to help everyone. So regarding the money available for planning, the Vision Zero planning, or the Safe Streets for All planning, if the federal resolution for setting a national Vision Zero goal, will the feds be eligible to claim this funding? It's a good question. No, they're not an eligible entity. And the funding says that you may set a zero goal. It doesn't require a community to do so to get that funding. So yeah, with the safety thing, yeah, so Florida should get a significant increase in their safety funding. California, Texas, New York. I think those 4 states account for more than half of biking and walking fatalities. And so all of those states will now have to spend 15% of their safety dollars on that. And I think California spends the most, which is about 8 or 9%. So even California is going to have to double their safety money. But Delaware, let me see, Delaware, Louisiana, Virginia, the Carolinas are both on the cusp. So it depends on what year. I don't remember if Georgia qualifies. A lot of it's New Mexico, definitely. So there's a bunch of states that are going to really have to up their safety funding. And I will send that. Actually, I might be able to. I don't know if that's, so this is the Senate plan. So the green, the light blue, and the dark blue would all have to spend 15% of their highway safety on this. Right. Can you talk for a minute on the Complete Streets Act and the Senate bill? Sure. Yes, I will share the slide. So the Complete Streets in the Senate bill, what they did, the Complete Streets bill was about creating standards and then spending money on those standards. They didn't put the implementation money, they did put the planning money. So states have to use a certain percentage of their planning money on creating complete street standards. This is, unless of course they have a state law against that. I don't know that there is a state law against that. But so then they have to create those standards. Those standards have to be approved by the US DOT. Once they have those standards, then they can use that money for other things. But all of that money, the next step I think would be a complete streets priority plan where you say, okay, how do we go back and fix these streets to become complete streets? But you could also do bike pen plans, vulnerable user plans. So that's the language. Our goal once this bill passes. So once the bill passes, congressional staff can write sort of directions to USDOT. It's called report language and how they sort of their intent. And then once USDOT gets the money, they write guidance to states because the states don't get this money automatically. They have to get reimbursed from USDOT. So USDOT writes the rules, the state builds a project based on those rules and then sends it for reimbursement. If somehow they don't follow the rules, USDOT could theoretically hold back the money. Doesn't really happen, but could happen, might happen. And so that, but they do try to follow those rules. So that my next step is, or our next step is lobbying USDOT to write those rules, write the best rules they can. Once the bill passes, write that guidance. So in the past, it's been things like making bike share eligible for funding because bike share is not actually in the law. Now it's, once this bill passes, it will be eligible in the law. It can be those things we talked about. Can we get guidance on fix it right? We definitely can for the discretionary grant programs. How is there another way we can work that in? So for that requirement that bridges be built with access for people biking and walking, how is that implemented? Is it that a state has to explain, like if they say, oh, it is cost prohibitive, are they going to have to explain that? Or are they just going to have to check a box? If they just have to check a box, we're not going to get a lot of access, right? If they have to do a benefit cost analysis versus the benefit of having a bike ped access versus the cost of adding it, well, now we're talking about something. And FHWA can write the rules on that. So something like that is really important. The vehicle safety stuff, there's NHTSA can do research and study. They can do a draft rule and put it out for comment, which is where like the hoods and bumpers are right now. Or they could do a final rule, which makes it a regulation. For things that are only in the middle, it's advocacy that can push it to be that final piece. in how they think about that. So right now, for instance, crash avoidance, it's right now, those technologies, it's under a voluntary agreement and there's no standard to them. So the fact that the bill is going to require them to start the process of creating a standard is really important. We're going to have to push it all the way. So the funding for bike share operation, it is now eligible under congestion mitigation and air quality. It is also eligible under the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, and it's eligible under transportation alternatives. I mean, it's been interpreted as being eligible. Now it's in the law eligible. What I do not think is there is that Transit Bike Share Act making the actual bikes eligible for transit funding. And so that's, right now the docks are eligible, but because transit can't fund any single occupancy vehicle, right now they can't fund the bikes of bike share, or that's been the ruling. So that's something, didn't get into this bill. We'll have to see if there's a non-legislative way to fix that. So, yeah, I think that's all I have for questions. We're a little bit over. I will send the slides. The recording will be available in a few days. Please, again, if you have any questions, send them to Christian at bikeleague.org, and we'll try to set up a public site for everyone to see those questions and answers. And yeah, thanks everyone. I know this was sort of a very detailed, complicated presentation, but thank you for hanging in there and for the questions. And yeah, look for action alerts. Please think about signing up for that webinar for the Lobby 201 on communication, because I think we might be able to get more out of reconciliation if we see a little more public interest in this work. All right, have a great weekend. Thanks, everybody.